Okay, welcome to everyone who's joining us via Zoom or live stream. We are here for our second week of St. Clement, St. Vincent de Paul, and Holy Name parishes in Chicago's Summer Theology on Tap in the Archdiocese of Chicago. Thanks to everyone for participating. And we're going to begin with an opening prayer that's going to be led by our Young Adult Board leader, Delaney Bunsley.
Thanks, Michael. We'll start in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God of justice, in your wisdom, you create all people in your image without exception. Through your goodness, open our eyes to see the dignity, beauty, and worth of every human being. Open our minds to understand that all your children are brothers and sisters in the same human family. Open our hearts to repent of racist attitudes, behaviors, and speech which demean others. Open our ears to hear the cries of those wounded by racial discrimination and their passionate appeals for change. Strengthen our resolve to make amends for past injustices and to right the wrongs of history. And fill us with courage that we might seek to heal wounds, build bridges, forgive and be forgiven, and establish peace and equality for all in our communities. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Delaney. So our presenters this evening are Darius, Villalobos, and Sister Mumbi Kigutha. Sister Mumbi is a member of the Sisters of the Precious Blood, Ohio. She was born and raised in Kenya. Currently, she is based here in Chicago, Illinois, as a part-time international consultant for the Reconciliation and Social Cohesion Department of Jesuit Refugee Services. She has worked with diverse vulnerable populations, including the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the United Nations Population Fund, and the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. In addition to a Master's of Business Administration and Marketing, Sister Mumbi earned a Master's of Arts in Justice Ministry and a Certificate in Pastoral Ministry at Chicago's Catholic Theological Union. Her theological interests center around womanist, Black, and Africana subjects. Darius Villalobos serves as the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministries Director of Diversity and Inclusion, responsible for NFCYM's efforts to live into its values as an inclusive and diverse organization. He worked for 9 years in a variety of roles for the Archdiocese of Chicago, and he currently serves on the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Advisory Team for Young Adult Ministry. So we're very grateful to have Darius and Sister Mumbi here with us this evening. And I'm going to unmute them so that they can be heard. Great. So how we're going to do this is we're going to have some questions lined up for our presenters to help us work through some of this. And then we're going to switch to a Q&A, at which point people will be invited to submit questions through the chat box, and we'll unmute people individually. All right. So Darius, you are a native Chicagoan, is that correct? Tell us a little bit more about how you came to work for the church and how the work for racial justice has been part of your ministry.
Well, thanks so much, Michael, and thank you for everybody who joined us this evening. Yes, I was born and raised in Chicago and very proud of it. I grew up in the Humboldt Park neighborhood of Chicago, which for those of you who are familiar with the Chicago area, looks a little bit different now than it did 20 years ago. At one point, not too long ago, Humboldt Park was considered the murder capital neighborhood in the United States. It was a really rough neighborhood, and the vast majority of people who lived there were Puerto Rican, of Puerto Rican descent, African American and Hispanic. And I grew up during that time when things were transitioning, kind of the 90s and early 2000s. I grew up in the church. My grandfather is a deacon in the church. All of his 8 kids were baptized and went to Catholic school. And so for me, it seemed very natural to be involved with the church, but I definitely had my own questions and challenges, especially my own teenage rebellious years of asking lots of questions. You know, why do we do this? Why do we believe that? But one thing that was really key for me was I was really blessed and privileged to go to a very large public high school here in Chicago, Lane Tech. I still call it Lane Tech, even though now it's Lane College Prep. And for those of you who are familiar with that institution. It's the largest high school in the state of Illinois. It's also one of the most diverse. And for me, that was my first experience coming from a very small parochial Catholic grammar school, which was 90% Latino, to just being immersed in diversity of cultures and religions and all sorts of people that I just didn't have the privilege to encounter before I got there. And so for me, that was a huge area for growth in me and really helped me to experience what diversity meant, what being multicultural meant, what being interreligious meant. But what that also did for me was, I think, getting away from sort of the institutional church by not going to a Catholic high school. It actually really helped me to wrestle with some of the questions about my faith that I needed. And I think that I learned more by having to understand my faith and explain it to others than I did just being in a community where everybody was the same and everybody believed the same things. So I've always learned to appreciate diversity. And I think as I went back to my parish and tried to get involved, I felt it was always being called to think of the church as larger than just my parish community. And so as I got to engage with youth ministers, with ministers from other parishes and communities, I really started to see that one of our greatest gifts in the church is our diversity. I know that it doesn't always feel that way, and sometimes it can even seem like more of a challenge than a gift. But I really saw my Catholic faith reflected in that diversity, in that diversity of cultures and expressions of how we celebrate our liturgies, and just the different ways that the Catholic faith can go beyond just those smaller experiences of church at kind of the parochial level. So for me, as I continue to grow as a minister, as someone of faith, I have continued to find God in the other, in the experiences of the Catholic Church outside of my own experience or worldview. Probably one of the most significant events for me was going to a World Youth Day. I was privileged enough to go to Spain for World Youth Day in Madrid. And seeing the church from that global perspective just gives you a whole new appreciation for what it means to be Catholic and what it means to say when we're universal. And so for me, that's always just been a thread that has continued to guide me in my work, to the point where, when this position opened up with NFCYM, I felt not only was this something I was feeling called to do, this was something that I felt was just such an important message and an important gift that the church needs right now, which is how do we learn to embrace that diversity and be more inclusive, because I think that reflects so much of our values as Catholics and who we're called to be.
Thank you. Great. Now, Mumbi, you are not a native Chicagoan, so can you tell us a little bit more about your story and what has brought you here to Chicago and the work you're doing?
Well, I'll give you the very short version of my story, but I would say it's my pursuit of God and how God was calling me that led me to Chicago. And it began maybe 13 years ago. I was still in formation to be a sister, and I met this really amazing nun called Sister Donna, whom I get to live with currently. And she pursued me, I would also say. I think she worked as God's agent in my life, and she was doing the kind of work that I was drawn to, which is working with very vulnerable people on the margins of society. And we kept in touch, and over a period of like 7 years, I eventually made the decision to join the Sisters of the Precious Blood. She was very instrumental in making that happen. I'm the first and still only African member of this congregation, but I was seeking a congregation that would be open to support me in the way I was feeling God calling me to minister. And I must say, it's been a very supportive congregation. We're in constant dialogue. And some of the things I love about my community, that instantly when the George Floyd and all the other scenarios happened, they created an anti-racism committee. And so that proactiveness is what attracts me and keeps me here. But I wasn't born in a Catholic family. I'm still the only Catholic in my immediate family. I converted in high school. I later on left the church, then came back much later. And my work with JRS and with having lived in different countries has exposed me to the beauty of the Catholic Church. the liturgy is so similar yet so different, because that's the beauty of Vatican II and the call to enculturation. And you find this in different styles of worship, some more solemn, some with a bit more movement, but it's beautiful. Like you walk into a church in any part of the world and you know what to do. That is not always guaranteed in life and in many parts of society. And I think then the church serves as an anchor for so many migrants or people who are constantly on the move, because that's one place where you immediately feel at home. And so the work I do with JRS is, when I was at CTU and having worked with refugees through the UN, I had been very struck at the psychosocial needs because of the trauma of being displaced, the trauma of violence you have experienced during the displacement, before the displacement, and Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation here in Chicago, where my two sisters and some Precious Blood priests work, offer training in the circle method of dialogue, of reconciliation. And I got trained in this method, and I thought it had so many similarities to indigenous ways of talking and healing, even in African cultures. And so I wrote my capstone project on that, hoping that eventually I would be able to test it. And then blessed encounter with some JRS staff said we have actually created a new department that focuses on reconciliation, which led to an interview. And so I'm now able to practice what my capstone was about, which is using reconciliation as a psychosocial tool, believing that without healing your trauma, you can never fully utilize opportunities presented to you. And we see that even in our inner city neighborhoods in America, in Chicago, that you can offer opportunities, but the trauma stops you from being able to fully maximize the opportunities presented to you. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing work. So thank you again to both of you for being here and leading us in this conversation. Our topic tonight is how to have difficult conversations around race and privilege and justice. And so I think it's probably important that at the outset, we define what those terms mean. So how would each of you kind of unpack those terms, race and justice and privilege? An easy one to start, and just an easy question.
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to emphasize that race only became a social construct much later on in life. When race began to be defined, it was, people would look at common languages, like how we define culture right now. This is how race was being defined. Over the centuries, and as oppressions of Black and Brown people began, this is when race became a social construct that is mainly based on physical appearance. And scientists have proven that there is no DNA differentiation between races. So this is purely a human and social construct. But race, those physical, as we understand it now, and in the context of this conversation, those physical attributes that differentiate us. So we are now living in a society where I see you and say, I'm going to send you to Michael, he's a white guy this tall. That's how we start all our conversations. Go pick up Mumbi at the airport. Oh, she's a Black tall woman. She'll probably speak with an accent. This is what race is about. But then using that as a tool to not just separate people, but sometimes also to oppress them or to discriminate them or to put them in these little neat boxes. This is how I understand race.
Yeah, that's a really helpful definition, Mumbi. I would just add to it, race is a technical term that actually is most used when we talk about census data. So in the United States, we use race as a way to define different groups, and it's often related back to biology, which is different than ethnicity, which is very much focused around cultural expression. So we have to understand these are two different realities. One of the complications about race too is that because it's a external or sort of a construct of society, race does not really describe the reality for certain people. So like if you look at the US Census, they ask the question, are you a Hispanic? And then that's separate than what race is considered. And so growing up, Latino growing up in a mostly Puerto Rican community, I was always struggling to figure out where my racial identity landed because I'm not included in that. Am I a white Hispanic? Am I a Black Hispanic? And the reality is my family is very mixed. So I would probably looking at myself say, oh, I'm white, but my sister is very dark and presents herself as Black. She considers herself Afro-Latina. So race is a really difficult thing to grasp. And I think once we recognize that it's external, you know, it's not necessarily how someone self-identifies, it helps us to really understand how the construct can sometimes become very challenging and can be very oppressive.
Thank you. So, I was to say, so related to that, the flip side of that then is, so why is it important for us to be aware of our privilege entering into these conversations around race?
Yeah, I'll pick up there. So just as I mentioned, you know, the reality with myself and my younger sister, I recognize the privileges that I have entering into a lot of spaces being more light-skinned than my sister. She has experienced levels of racism and discrimination just because she presents as Black. And people will make assumptions about her education, about her background, where she grew up in. My sister has a master's degree in education. Like, she is, you know, as smart as a whip, and in so ways much harder working than I am when it comes to school stuff. But people would make assumptions based on just looking at us, who we are, what we are. So acknowledging our privilege is important, because privilege isn't a bad thing. Privilege is actually, you know, just unseen or sort of social advantages that you have, and you can control those things. It's very much based on the society we're in and what is valued in that society. So being a man, being light-skinned, being difficult to identify with a particular culture or race, those are all privileges that I have and that I come into any situation carrying. I'm aware of those privileges because if I'm not conscious of them, I might actually end up putting someone down or excluding someone unintentionally. And I think that's the important thing, that privilege is not a bad thing in itself. It's how we're using it, or how we recognize that privilege sometimes works to our benefits, but at the same time, if we're benefiting, then someone's at a disadvantage.
And yes, just to add on to what Darius has said, and lots of privileges are not due to anything you do to earn them, although hard work sometimes plays into it. So you get an opportunity and build on it. But it's advantages that you have that others do not. And it runs a whole range of things. And yes, race is one of them: ethnicity, physical ability, gender, sexuality, body type, attractiveness according to how the world has taught us that this is attractive and this is not attractive, education level, neurological differences. And it's important then to be able to always look. I do face oppression because I'm a Black woman. I'm a Black woman in the Catholic Church that is very patriarchal, especially in this part of the world. Then it's also very white. But then I also do have my privileges. I'm well educated, I'm a nun, which gives me access to spaces that so many other Black women in the church do not have access to. So it's always important, like, to name, and this is an exercise I encourage everybody to do later on. Come up with a piece of paper and write down, what are my privileges? What advantages do I have that others do not have in my circles?
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you for those very thoughtful explanations to help center our conversation. I do want to apologize for anyone that was trying to live stream on Facebook. We had some live stream issues, but we should be up and running over there now. So welcome to anyone who's joining us on Facebook. Okay, so you know, tonight we have this event that's being hosted by a number of North Side Chicago parishes, and you know, many of the people who are participating in this conversation are white, and you know, but they also want to do the work. They want to commit to long-term dismantling of white supremacy, to working for racial justice, but they might feel like they don't know where to begin. They might be afraid of entering in the conversations. They're going to mess it up. What advice would you have for how to start this out?
I think you have begun very well by getting some education about the issues. We all have our blind spots, and there are constantly things that are not in our periphery, just based on interest, based on who you hang out with, based on your work. And this is one of those areas that you find that America has some very homogeneous communities. So you might find that your circle of friends is almost exactly like you, you know? I've traveled in parts of America, people actually almost look the same, just because maybe German immigrants settled there, and everybody kind of even looks related. So if that is your circle, then you need to be educated about the experiences of other people. And what has happened, as we have seen with the incidences of very overt anti-Black racism in these past few days, which have led to lots of protests, a lot of people are having like their aha moments. So there's nothing new. It has always been there. But now we are living at a time when things are going viral on social media. We cannot escape them. We cannot avoid them. So what happens then? There is a temptation to rush into acting, and that is not a good. And Catholics, we are good at rushing to act. This is missionary activity for many years all over the world, but it's good to first learn, and to learn from those who live this every day, who have no choice to opt out. This is their life. It's life or death for so many people in this part of the world and in other parts of the world. So get educated, and that can happen through, yes, storytelling, having last week the Bishop, Darius and I, and other people you're going to have, but there are also great books. We are living at a time where so much has been written about this. There are documentaries on Netflix about it. There are movies about it. Dedicate some amount of time to learning. Why do I say this? Because constantly the media and the world is sending us signals about white privilege and white supremacy. So you kind of actively have to counter it on this side with debunking these myths and debunking this constant flux of information. So there's a lot of catching up to do here. Because if you've been going on through your life for 40, 50 years and never really paid attention to this, well, that's about 50 years of catching up you have to do. Yeah.
No, I very much appreciate that, Mumbi, that education is so important, and there's a lot of places to start education. But I also would add, a good place to start is listening. I think we struggle sometimes to take that first step, which is to really listen to the experiences of other people. And we have to really honor those experiences. Listening is a skill that comes with practice, but it's also a skill that we have to learn to listen, not with the intention to respond, but to really listen to understand. And I would say whenever you're entering into a conversation to talk about an issue like this, something that is so charged and has such effects on people personally, we have to really listen with a sense of understanding, because we're going to hear things that are going to challenge us. We're going to hear things that we don't agree with. We're going to hear things that are going to surprise us and kind of make us question a lot of the things that we hold as assumptions. And to listen, not to respond, but to really understand what the other person is sharing with us is so important. I also want to pick up on that idea of, we tend to jump into the action. We see, and then we want to act. Well, within the church, we have a really wonderful tradition that requires us, before we get to the action part, we have to judge. That see, judge, act model is so important in us being able to do that. And another word for judgment is discern. So what are we discerning from what we've seen? What are we learning from that? How do we engage with our tradition, with education, with research that's out there before we move into action? But I would say that that key piece is that there has to be some form of reflection before we move into action, because sometimes our actions, as well attended as intentioned as they are, can actually end up hurting or continuing that vicious cycle of holding people at the margins or at the peripheries, even if that isn't our intention.
Thank you both for that.
Sorry, Michael. I'd also just like to add that I know you mentioned earlier before everybody came on that you're going to look at healthcare. It's very important to kind of divide all this into sections. Otherwise, it becomes overwhelming. So look at the spectrum of people you're listening to, and look at the intersection between race and other forms of oppression. So we are talking about people living with disabilities, LGBTQIA, and all this. Are you having this spectrum of people represented as you listen? Because everybody experiences it differently. And then divide the sectors, healthcare, employment, housing, and tackle them one by one. And with each learning, there should be a response coming out of it. And the response for me should be multi-tier. So there's a grassroots organizing you do, the high advocacy about who are we voting for and how are we going to hold them accountable after we vote. And then where are we also investing? Because the biggest way to undo structural and systemic racism is to resource Brown and Black communities. So it's all this, and it has to be gone about in a very systemic way, because it is systemic racism. Yes.
We jumped ahead. We got so much already. No, it's great. Thank you to both of you. So I want to come back to that issue of other layers, because I do think that involves a little bit more unpacking. But first, I want to say, like, at this point in the conversation, we're trying to do this. We're hopefully starting out right. But how do we, aspiring allies, make sure that we don't center white guilt or center our own selves in this process of trying to work to dismantle systemic racism?
So I want to say this in a way that really kind of gets to the heart of when we talk about systemic racism, what the problem is. One of the things we have to recognize is that it is not the work of Black and brown people to fix systemic racism. It's not, because the truth is, if it was up to us, it wouldn't exist in the first place. We're the ones who are at the disadvantage for it. So when we talk about being in solidarity with our Black and brown brothers and sisters, we have to recognize that if we are white, if we are in that space of privilege, part of the work that we need to do is to really lift up and center the experiences of others and the truth that other people are sharing with us. Because what can very easily happen is we put the burden on those who are already feeling the burden of oppression, already feeling the burden of marginalization, to try and figure out how to do this. And that is an unnecessary burden that you're putting on other individuals who are already experiencing a real sense of heaviness. The most consistent thing I've heard in the last month and a half, 2 months since these conversations have started, especially from a lot of African Americans that I'm privileged to be in conversations with, they're tired. They're tired because this conversation is something that they experience and have to deal with day in and day out. And now everybody's coming to them wanting to engage in conversation. And so, yes, we have a responsibility in whatever spaces we are to do some of this work, but we really have to honor the fact that for many of our brothers and sisters, this is their lived experience day in and day out. And so we cannot add extra burden on them by having them be the ones to tell us how to figure this out. That's why it's so important to do some of this work ourselves and educating ourselves, doing the work of reading and asking questions. Don't come and ask me, how do I figure out to dismantle systemic racism, if you haven't done some of the work yourself to read a book or to read a story or to educate yourselves, because then it just comes across as you're asking other people to do more work and they've already been doing the work. And I think that's just so important, that we have to honor their reality, their truth, their experience in this process, because there's a lot of work that comes with that. It's the opposite of privilege. It's the disadvantage of being a person of color in the system that we're in.
I took a retreat a few years ago at a certain retreat house, and I was very encouraged when I came in. It was a place run by sisters that they had made a commitment to anti-racism work a few years past. And I went for Mass that evening, and when the Mass was over, a sister walked over to me and she apologized for white privilege and racism. And it was a bit strange for me because I didn't know her, but I appreciated it and went on about my day. The next day at Mass, she came up to me again with the same statement. So I started making sure I leave as the last song was being sung, because within me, I was like, what next? So that's another thing. You cannot be seeking absolution from Black and brown people for what has happened. The best absolution is to work to dismantle racism. But also, as Darius was saying about not expecting us to educate you, there are people in this line of work, brown and Black people, who are doing this work. And when you're approaching them, seeking their help, their expertise, you also need to compensate them. Minority tax is a real thing. And as we are saying, there are no resources in brown and Black communities. That's one of the biggest problems of racism. So as you look to this work, as a church, as a small community of learners, is to think that this is something that is worthy of our time and should be fairly compensated. But even if you're approaching a friend, or there's somebody in your periphery, or you've been working with brown and Black people and you've never really had a conversation with them, you need to go about it in a point of I'm asking this of you. Are you willing? And what would be a suitable compensation for this time that you're giving me? Because first of all, remember that it's a re-traumatizing experience every time a brown and black person has to teach, because you're recounting your own experiences of racism. It is very painstaking work. And that's the other part that we never address, the lack of resources for healing and trauma in brown and black people. It's generational, it's been going on for so long. So that would be a good way of going about it. But this is also a time to just shout out a book. So you want to talk about race by Juoma Oluo. That is a good starting point for anybody. She breaks it down so simply that within that you can find the tools to go about conversations, to address your own privilege, and action points about where to start doing something about it.
Wonderful, thank you. And we're actually just going to put a link to buy that book right into the chat box for anyone who wants to. And of course,
independent bookstores, not from Amazon.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the, so you want to talk about race. All right. We'll have it in the chat box. I don't want to get hung up. But yes, as Mumbi said, ideally from independent and even more ideally, black and brown owned bookstores, local bookstores. So Darius, these conversations are not new. Our church has been involved in them in good and not so good ways for centuries. What are some of the resources that already exist from the church side in terms of thinking about these conversations on racism and white supremacy?
No, you're right, Michael. This is not a new issue. This is not a new issue for the U.S. church in particular. We have a long history of addressing the challenges and the realities of racism that exists in our society. I think one of the things we have to engage with is both educate ourselves on what the church has been saying on these issues, but also educating ourselves in Black Catholic history and culture. So there's two things there. There are a number of documents that have been published by bishops. A number of statements have been written over the years. I want to just highlight something that I find particularly interesting. This comes directly from a quote from the Bishops' Conference, and I think it's an important one. It says, we recognize and applaud the readiness of many Americans to make new strides forward in reducing and eliminating prejudice against minorities. We are convinced that the majority of Americans realize that racial discrimination is both unjust and unworthy of this nation. We do not deny that changes have been made, that laws have been passed, that policies have been implemented, and we do not deny the ugly external features of racism which marred our society and have in part been eliminated. But neither can be denied that too often what has happened has been only a covering over, not a fundamental change. That quote is from the bishop's document, Brothers and Sisters to Us, published in 1979. 1979. If I would have told you that was written 5 months ago, you probably would have believed me. And I think that's part of the challenge for us, is that even though the church has been engaged in dialogue around racism for a long time, we have not seen the steps taken to really make the change necessary to dismantle it within our society and within the church itself. And I think that's an important thing, that because it hasn't been at the forefront of our pro-life issues, and racism is a pro-life issue, it's a fundamental issue that we need to engage with, we have not seen a lot of change and a lot of growth on this issue. When it comes to resources, I think one of the best resources that I'll point to is Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. This was written by Father Brian Massengale. He's a foremost scholar in this area. And I think it's a dense read, it's a heavy read, but it's one that really gets to the root of how racism has been part of the history of the Catholic Church for a long time. You can look at many different resources that have been published and put out about this, dealing with that reckoning of the church's complacency in that. I point to the work that's being done in Georgetown and their history of having slaves. And now in the last few years, students were the ones who led the charge to address that history and that omission from history as part of its institution's structure, its building. You know, the slaves were that Georgetown Jesuits had were used to keep the school afloat during difficult times. That's a reality. That's a real part of the church's history. And then I think we also have to immerse ourselves in the long and beautiful history of Black Catholics here in the United States. Wonderful people like Sister Thea Boma, uh, Father Augustus Tolton, Chicago's very own, the first African-American priest, in the United States. There are stories and history that is so rich within the community, and that's part of our history too. That isn't Black Catholic history, that is US Catholic history, that is part of our Catholic Church's history. And so to embrace those saints, people who are on the way to beatification, to engage and understand that history, I think that is a way for us to be able to grow and understand how we as a church both are wrestling with racism, but are also being called to experience the beauty and diversity that our church has. And by lifting that up, it also gives us a greater understanding of what it means to be Catholic here in the United States.
Thank you to both of you. And I do want to I put a bunch of links in the chat box. I put a link to the book that Mumbi recommended, as well as Chicago's only Black woman-owned bookstore. We also have a link to the U.S. Bishop's pastoral letter that Darius was quoting from. And the last thing I posted is actually the Jesuits. So I am, in fact, myself a graduate of Georgetown University, and the university became the first Catholic institution to authorize reparations. Now, whether you think it's anywhere near enough, that's a whole other, we'll have a whole other conversation about that, but recognizing that any work towards racial justice will require reparations. And so the Jesuits have started a number of projects, including the Slavery History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project, and they are actually documenting their own religious orders' history of enslavement and the Catholic Church in the United States. So if you want to educate yourself and learn more about the role the church played, not only in upholding things like segregation and all that, but actively enslavement of human beings, you can check out some of those resources. All right, Sister Mumbi, you are working not only with people who are predominantly persons of color, but people who are immigrants and refugees who are facing layers of trauma and injustice. What is the experience of a refugee coming to Chicago?
So I predominantly worked with refugees in Dayton, Ohio, and I was meeting them like a day after they have arrived in this country or 2 days after they have arrived in this country. And when you live in America, you quickly realize that first impressions are made on the basis of the color of your skin. That is the first thing. And then remember that for many formerly displaced peoples, their interactions with white people has always been that the white people in their lives have a lot of immense power and absolute power in their lives, because it starts with, if you're much older, you experienced colonialists and missionaries, because the story of independence in many parts of Africa is very young. Then second, once you're displaced, the humanitarian workers who are making life and death decisions over your life tend to be white. It's the UN, it's other NGOs. So these are the people deciding where you sleep, whether you get a place to sleep, how much food you're going to get, hygiene, non-food items and all that. Then later on, you also encounter people either from embassies as you're trying to file your claims for resettlement, that the ones interviewing you. So it's already a very skewed relationship, and it's one of absolute power. And they come here, and again, who's resettling them? But then there are lots of immediate concerns, you see, and I have to point out that a lot of resettlement being done in this part of the world is being done by Catholic agencies. So some of the challenges I would run into is like having really non-appropriate food items stocked in the house. So you find a ham. I had never seen a ham in a bone growing up. So you can imagine the challenges of this, or purple red cabbage for that matter. And these are things that really a simple Google search could tell you, like what is the basic diet in Kenya, and stock these items. But it's also where they are housed in substandard housing. This is the first time I encountered that there are slum landlords in this part of the world. I've encountered everything from fleas to rats running through the living room, and they're expected to live in these houses. And then they're taken through this process where within 2 days of arriving, they're signing 1-year leases, which they cannot get out of, and nobody's explaining to them what a lease is. So you're stuck in a house that is literally falling apart around you in very unsafe neighborhoods for a full year. And some of the success stories you hear from the resettlement agencies is that we are able to get them on their feet in 4 months. we all know that there's no way somebody who has spent 12 to 20 years in a refugee camp or settlement who doesn't speak any English will be able to be self-sufficient in 4 months. So what happens? They quickly get factory jobs that pay them the minimum wage. And what happens with these factories is that they're always laying them off to ensure that they never give them proper employment benefits. So they stay on as temporary workers. I was just in Dayton talking to some of these people, and some of them 4 years later are yet to have an employment contract. They're still temporary workers and not getting benefits. And by this time, they have nobody in the community to help them. They cannot keep up with their English classes because between working 12 hours a day and taking care of their children and using public transport, when are you ever going to get to English classes? So there are so many things that are set up really for me that are just geared to make them fail. And now we move to the church. I mean, we were kind of late to accept that Latinx sisters and brothers were a force to reckon with in this country. And now we have seen that the church has finally almost caught up by ensuring that you will go to many places, the hymn books will have a few Spanish songs, they have Spanish speaking pastors, but it was still a very late response. And you still find the problems of where the Spanish speaking population have mass in the basement or in the hall, and the church is reserved for the white population. And sometimes the white population is such a small number compared to the Spanish population, the church. You find cases where they're sharing the church and the Spanish mass is first thing in the morning at 7 a.m. and the last thing in the day at 1 p.m. And there is no attempt to integrate. There is no attempt to have representation of Latinx members in the parish council, in the decision-making positions of the churches. And now we are looking at all these new waves of immigrants. And are we as a church already preparing, like for instance, by training people in French, in other languages, to minister to this population? So what I've found is that children who had started their faith formation classes and catechesis come and fall through the cracks because there's nobody to minister to this population. And what happens? There are other churches that are quicker to respond. And what is happening? There's a lot of movement to other faith denominations that are creating the spaces to minister to them as they need. And I keep wondering, if we're truly to integrate churches and try and work together, I wonder about the richness. Yes, Mass might change from being 1 hour long to 1.5 hours, just because some of us like dancing and that takes a bit more time. But would it really be that bad to have a 1.5 hour long Mass every Sunday? I mean, I have gone to baseball games, and they take forever and nobody's actually watching. I was fascinated. Everybody was like eating and chatting and nobody was watching the game, but it went on and on forever. And this is the other function of church. It serves also as a social function. This is the place, especially in busy America, that people come and get together, get refreshed. I mean, imagine the beauty if we had church together each and every day, and not just that one cultural day a year where we then say, oh, we love how they dress, we love how they sing, we love their food, and then no more communication until next year. If we are truly talking about a global and universal church, we need to do the work. It is not easy, it takes forever, but the life of discipleship was not meant to be all roses, It's in that effort that you reap the richest fruits. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So for those who are watching, we've got 2 more questions that we want to present, and then we're going to switch over to participant-based Q&A. So if you have a question for one of our presenters, you can submit it to me in the chat box, and we will call on people for the Q&A portion. All right. So two more things, and then we'll do Q&A. So Mumbi, you listed. I'm going to miss a few. So if we're going to do the work for racial justice, you said, first of all, something very profound earlier, which is don't come up to me looking for absolution, which is something actually that fits well with what Bishop Mark Seitz said last week when we were talking about an examination of conscience of our role in systemic injustice, but a confession of it and sincere contrition. But what can we be doing in terms of penitence and repentance? And one of the things he cautioned us against was thinking that we were already at the place where we could do penance because it makes it seem like the sin is in the past and therefore we're ready for absolution. So I thought that was a really profound insight that you said. And if we want to do the work, we have to work for, I hear, housing, I hear access to food, I hear access to healthcare, I hear immigrant services. And so what are the other justice issues that are inherently related that you see Catholics need to be working on if they want to be working for anti-racism?
One of the big things I see, and it's an oxymoron to call it the criminal justice system because it's not about justice, and it's the unfair sentencing, you know. It is criminalizing entire communities. It is that it's become a form of slavery. The money, the exploitation of trying to make a phone call to somebody who's incarcerated, of when you go to visit them and how much you're charged to buy a card to get food, which is overpriced, terrible food when you're in the visiting room. There's a whole business going on there. We are criminalizing juveniles, 12-year-olds. I just read today, there is a 13-year-old locked up somewhere in the US because she did not finish her homework during this time of COVID, and she had a previous arrest record, and the judge sent her back to the juvenile system during COVID. But something else the church needs to do. I understand the corporate and the business decisions that are going into merging of parishes and closing down of parishes, but they're affecting brown and black communities in a very unjust way. We already have food desert, environmental desert, recreational deserts in so many of these communities. The churches have remained as like the beacon of hope. And now we are in the process of closing down so many of these places that offer not just spiritual resources, but after school programs, food pantries, outreach to the elderly, and we are moving out of these neighborhoods. These are also the neighborhoods where people are less likely to have a car to drive to a church in a different neighborhood. I wish these things could be addressed. And that's the other part, environmental racism. Look at where the factories that spew terrible smoke are located. Which communities are they? Look at employment that we know in America, if you call to inquire about a job and you have a name that sounds different or an accent that sounds different, the chances of you being told there is no vacancy are pretty high. We know of unfair remuneration when people are employed. For the longest time, we were taught in HR that somebody's salary was top secret, but it's been used to oppress people because people doing the same amount of work, you find that Black and brown people are earning way less than white people in the same position. And this is also a gender imbalance. This has always been that men are earning more than women for doing the same amount of work. But now there are these other intersectional factors that are making some people, the spectrum of imbalance in how much people are compensated for work is astonishing. So that's another area that, is there a way that affluent parishes could partner with poorer parishes to ensure that they are sustained and go on? I would say look at foreign policy. I am biased, I'm from Kenya, but we have always said that when the US gets a cold, when the US sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold. So how are we wielding trade policies, foreign policies? It's a global church. And so we have to know that whatever is decided on this part of the world affects the rest. And to whom much has been given, much is demanded. So America earned this title as being the greatest superpower in the world. And that also comes with a lot of demands and expectations from the rest of the world.
Thank you. Which is why we're not just going to have a summer theology on tap on the work of addressing racial injustice. We are trying to commit our parish community, our city of Chicago, Catholic community, Christians more broadly, to systemic anti-racism. We're going to be doing things on immigration, on healthcare, on housing, on mass incarceration. And hopefully throughout this process, we'll be educating ourselves about the intersectional work that needs to be done. So one thing that Mumbi mentioned, and Darius, I want to throw over to you, is that, our parishes are rather segregated, and in fact, we're going to learn next week with Matthew Kressler, a little plug for his Theology on Tap next week. That is not accidental. In fact, white Catholics were actively involved in keeping the city segregated, and a lot of times our parishes reflect that. Certainly our parish community in Lincoln Park is not a particularly diverse community when it comes to race and ethnicity. So what practical things can Catholic communities, particularly largely white communities, be doing to go outside their own borders to forming those relationships with the other parishes in the city?
So Mumbi mentioned this earlier, and I just want to lift this up again. We have to recognize that so much of what we experience in liturgy is often Eurocentric and white-centered focus. The best way to be one and in solidarity with others is to be with them, and not just in a way where they come to us and share their gifts and stories, but for us to go to them. I would encourage anybody who has not had the privilege of going to a Black Catholic liturgy to go do that. You know, as soon as we can get back to churches, I know it may take a little while for some of our parishes to reopen, but to really have that experience of worshiping and praying with others. I grew up in a mostly Hispanic community. I didn't know what sort of the traditional good liturgical music was growing up, because most of what I grew up in was bilingual, the hymnals that Floricanto hymnals, which have, you know, music. There was a bunch of music that I didn't even realize wasn't originally in English, just because we translated everything for the second and third generation we grew up in. So going outside of our comfort zone and being in solidarity with others means going to their places of worship, going to their homes and worshiping with them. And don't just worship and eat with them. You know, that's so much of how in many of our communities and many of our cultures, we come together, and that's how we share, by breaking bread. And that's biblical. You know, that goes back to Jesus's time. So taking the time to do that, I think, is really important. The other thing is that we have an opportunity, particularly in a place like Chicago that has so many parishes, to be in relationship with people in other parish communities. And it's not just about talking about church stuff. It's about learning about the issues and the challenges that those communities are facing and how they're addressing them. I'll lift up a story that was really relevant for me. When I first started working as a professional in the church, I was working in Pilsen and Little Village. I was working for a parish as a youth minister there, worked with a number of groups. Many of you may have heard, but maybe didn't hear this story, that in April, there was a factory that they knocked down a turbine that caused all of this coal dust to enter into the neighborhood, and the neighbors had no warning of this. This was in the middle of a global pandemic where everybody was worried about respiratory issues and getting sick, and this neighborhood ended up experiencing this terrible environmental tragedy. And this was approved by the mayor's office. This was approved by, you know, all of the people who needed to sign off on this. That is an injustice. And I know the parishes in that community were organizing and reaching out and trying to find ways to address that. But if we are not, from wherever we are in the city, Logan Square, Lincoln Park, out in the suburbs, if we're not paying attention to those stories and being in solidarity with them, we're missing what we're called to be as Catholics. Because the Catholics that live in Little Village are just as important as the Catholics that live anywhere else. They are our brothers and sisters. And so we have a unique opportunity to not just be engaged, but learn from them what are the issues that they are being challenged by, and to be in solidarity with them. You know, Mumbi mentioned a lot of issues. Affordable housing is one that's really a challenge right now in the Chicagoland area. There's a lot of need for advocating for that. Healthcare is another. And then the parish closures issue, I think, is really one that all of us are kind of experiencing this process together, but it should challenge us to want to get outside of our comfort zone and learn more about our brothers and sisters in other communities.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for, you know, all that you've already shared. We've packed a lot into this hour. And, you know, I think that certainly one of the things that we really want to try and do is more of what you said, which is experiencing the liturgy and breaking bread with sisters and brothers around the city. One of the things we talk about with our RCIA candidates is you're not being baptized or confirmed into the Church of St. Clement. You're being, you know, baptized as followers of Jesus, and you become part of the Church of Chicago and, of course, the global church. And so if you're only experiencing St. Clement, you're not experiencing the church. You know, you're experiencing a local version of it. So I'm going to go to Q&A now, and our first question comes from Mary.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mary. Hi, friend Darius, who is my old friend, and Mumbi. Really nice to meet you. Thank you so much for your presence and for being here with us tonight. My question to both speakers this evening is how we do that kind of engagement with Black Catholic parishes in Chicago while respecting that our white presence may create feelings of unsafety. How do we do that engagement without alienating or simply being respectful of their spaces and their communities where there may not be oftentimes white people present? And I ask particularly in regard to the acute times that we're living in. And because in other sort of racial healing work that I participate in, we've actually created homogenous sort of circle work for racial healing so as to create spaces to share. And so that's where that idea came from in terms of how that applies to engagement and outreach with Black churches like Darius was sort of talking about. Thank you.
So I think the Black parish that I attend most often is St. Benedict the African. And from what I've experienced, it is kind of a teaching parish. There are so many student groups that visit there. First of all, the architecture is amazing. I've never encountered a church that so closely mimics a traditional African dwelling. The vessels they have chosen to use, the vestments and all that. But I think the first thing is to definitely talk to the pastor or the parish council and say, this is what we are hoping to achieve, give us guidance. But there's a model of the missionaries that wasn't bad. It was a realization that when people are hungry or people do not have shelter or healthcare, they will not listen to the word of God. And right now there are so many issues devastating these communities. And one of the ways to come in is to show a concern, a real concern for the issues that affect them. At the moment, a lot of Chicago public schools are having listening sessions and voting on whether they'll keep the police in the public schools. And we know this is the school to prison pipeline. This is how so many of our kids end up being detained for the first time in their lives. I think is to reach out to the pastor and let them know what are the points you're trying to make in your town hall meetings. And this is one of the advantages of COVID is that we are now having these meetings by Zoom, so you don't even have to drive across town, and showing up and amplifying the voices of community leaders. This is the allyship. I mean, we saw with the protests, just by a white person putting their body in front of a Black person, the response changed almost immediately. And by having meetings that are traditionally Black and brown, suddenly having 15, 20 white people who are amplifying these voices, the people who make the decisions at the top of the public school systems and all, they will start paying attention, because it's all about votes and worrying that their positions will not be guaranteed. It's a political game. If you start showing up in these spaces respectfully, the church will welcome you, because they will have trust that it's about them, that you're amplifying them, that you're centering them, that you're there in a respectful whatever. And even that penitence will come for me faster. And your own healing, for me, the absolution comes from God, is to know that I have put my interests behind those of Black and brown people, centered them, and we are seeing changes happen in their communities. I think of so many landlords on the south side who live on the north side. Some of us know these people. We know this is how they make their money. When do we call them out? How are we calling them out and saying there's a standard to housing? I mean, when I drove through Englewood and back of the yards after the protests and the destruction that ensued, I did not weep because of the destroyed strip malls. I wept at all the boarded up houses, because we accepted that people can live in such neighborhoods where the grass is not cut, where the garbage is picked up at random hours of the day and random times of the week, and a family will be the only house standing on a whole street full of boarded up houses. And we, at some point, said this was okay. So the strip malls being destroyed, there was no extra like devastation. The devastation has always been there. But the focus was on these businesses, and who owns these businesses? Most of them do not live in those neighborhoods. Yes, Darius.
I'll just add to what Mumbi said. So much of this has to be grounded in relationship. And I think the key thing for any time that we are going as a guest to someone is we have to develop relationships with individuals. It's a simple question, but I think it's a relevant one that a lot of people are asking right now. Like, who are your Black friends? And if it's just one, I think you have to recognize that there's work that needs to be done there. The circle of people that we have is one of the few things that we have a lot of control over. And I'm not saying go out there and find a Black friend just to have a Black friend. Part of this is about the investment in that relationship and getting to know others. And so when we show up to a community, we're not showing up just out of the blue, but we're coming through a relationship with somebody that we've known and developed there. As Mumbi said, many of those parishes and communities are going to be welcoming and opening, but you have to also understand too, they're going to be very hesitant and skeptical. Because there have been people who have come there and with not the best intentions. And so maybe reaching out before you go there, reaching out to the pastor or someone on the staff, getting to find out a little bit more about that community before you attend. And then that way you're not showing up, out of the blue, but you're showing up and there's already a relationship there. They're expecting you there versus you just coming and saying, hey, I want to learn more about fill in the blank parish. A great example of that, St. Columbanus Parish, if you're not familiar, on the south side, Father Matt O'Donnell is a really wonderful man and a great preacher. He really got me through COVID when I was looking for a community to connect with for Sunday masses. And I think his sensibility as a pastor who is white, is very aware of his whiteness, but has been so present to that community, has been very much in solidarity with the African-American community there, I think allows other people to enter in. And it's like, if this, young, redheaded Irish kid, from the north suburbs can do this and be part of this community, there's hope for all of us to find a way to feel at home in any parish that we go to, because our Catholic faith definitely moves us beyond those borders or beyond those barriers that sometimes are limited by race, language, and culture. But it very much, I think, really hinges on, are we taking the time to develop relationships with people from those communities? Because that, more than anything, will give you the confidence and the ability to go into those spaces and feel like you belong.
Thank you to both of you. I'm going to go to James now, who has a question.
So thanks. Thank you, Clement. So I'm sorry I was a little late at the beginning of this conversation. I was actually at a parish council meeting in a suburb on the north side of Chicago. And the presentation that we had tonight was from the Archdiocese. And I'm so proud to say that my neighbors pushed very hard back against the Arch, because, as you know, with the Renew My Church initiative that we had about tonight, there are three factors that they consider to in deciding how the Renew My Church proceeds. One is that for a church to be considered viable, they've got to have an attendance of 800 people per weekend. The second is that you have to raise $750 a year. And there's a third criteria. So we questioned the individual from the Archdiocese about the equity in applying this criteria as a one-size-fits-all across the state. And the person was very hesitant to say that this criteria could be adjusted, or that even more concerning was that that the people at the Arch didn't think the pandemic would affect this criteria. And in light of the discussion that Sister Mumbi was having about spiritual deserts that are being created by Renew My Church, especially on the south side, we were very concerned that the Arch was being very hesitant to acknowledge the limitations of this process. And so I'm wondering, to Darius, what can we do because this is a real process. The Arch is continuing with the process, notwithstanding the pandemic, notwithstanding the fact that this one-size-fits-all criteria has in the past failed and is more likely to have consequences that are going to have major disparities. How can we build the solidarities with the churches in the neighborhoods that are most affected by the pandemic that the Arch seems very blind to, at least based on the presentation tonight, so that we make sure that we are not just focused on these structural issues that the church seems to have for grounded and forgotten about the spiritual side. Like Sister Mumbi was saying, some of the more vibrant churches spiritually on any weekend are on the south side, I'm sorry to say. So what can we do is the question.
Thank you, James.
I'll add two things. James, I really appreciate you lifting up that concern. It's a real concern right now in this current moment as the diocese is going through a major, major transformation and change. Two things I would ask you to consider. Being in solidarity with those communities means both understanding their realities and being educated on what those challenges of those communities are. We may not want to acknowledge it, but money talks. And when a community from the north suburbs, speaks up on behalf of their sharing parish or their sister parish, on the northwest side, it really does make a difference. I think also being in solidarity also means accompanying them and sharing the resources we have. And that can be part of our solidarity, part of our way of advocating for those communities. The point that Mumbi mentioned about spiritual deserts, it's very real. Look at the story of West Humboldt Park. They closed the last parish in that neighborhood, probably in the late 90s, St. Peter Claver, which was a predominantly African-American parish. There was no Catholic community in West Humboldt Park for about 10 years. And what happened was there was a demographic shift, and suddenly that neighborhood became filled with Latinos, Hispanics that came in and were mostly Catholic, but didn't have a Catholic church anywhere near them. And so what happened? Protestant storefront churches opened up all over the place. Most of those people just went to the church that was convenient to them rather than traveling to the next parish. And we lost a whole community of people who grew up Catholic, but didn't continue to be Catholic because their needs weren't being met. And that's because the church abandoned that area. So that's a real problem, and that's a real challenge for us to have to deal with. And I think what you're lifting up is the changes that are happening. We can't be so focused on our particular grouping or our particular parish reality and not recognize how it's affecting our brothers and sisters in other communities. Being with them, being in conversation with them, learning from each other, I think is a great way both for us to learn about the others, but also to be lifting up their voices during this time of major change and major transition for our local church.
I would add that many years ago, women began fighting for their rights, but what happened? Black and brown women got left behind. Then Black people began fighting for their rights, and again, Black women got left behind. What I'm saying is that if we go ahead with Renew My Church without calling some things to a halt and say, hey, let's rethink this, we'll never be able to turn back the clock. When we say, let's go forward and we'll come back and address those issues, we have seen that that never works. And I think we cannot underestimate the power of people in affluent parishes writing letters to the diocese and saying, something has got to change. We need to have this discussion a different way. What is the theological and pastoral response to, yes, very real world issues of finances, but is this how to go about it? The church wouldn't be the church if we had thought about money. The church did not have money at some point. Churches in many parts of the world do not have money, but somehow we find ways to start. James is from Kenya as myself. We find ways to start outstations because we have prioritized that it's essential for people to have access to church life. So I think it's time to start letter writing. St. Clement's is a very influential parish in this diocese. St. Vincent de Paul, Holy Name, if just these three parishes were to write a letter as concerned Catholics and say, we need to rethink this, something would change. But if we continue going ahead and without especially considering the new challenges that COVID-19 has brought, which has completely shifted how we do church, how we worship, this situation might continue for another year or two and until we get a vaccine. It's also shifting how church is being done all over the world. This is a time to stop and say, what is church supposed to be for people? Are we meeting that for all people equally? And let's have a different conversation. I know a lot of money has gone into renew my church, but the bigger loss will be if we start losing half of our faithful to other faith denominations that are stepping in where we're stepping out. Yet we are the biggest church in the world.
Thank you to both of you. Got a couple more. So I'm going to go to Zach, who has kind of a comment and a question attached to it. Zach, I think we're having trouble. I think we're having trouble hearing you. Zach, okay, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to read the question that Zach submitted. So Zach said, I don't think I fit in with the narrative of what's been going on. I'm Irish, not 50%, 100%. My family lives in an Irish Catholic community in Assumption, Ohio. I have relocated homes over 20 times in my life due to my father's financial status. To this day, my mother still suffers from a chronic illness and has accepted the fact that she'll never afford it. I'm the only one in my family with higher education. What's your answer to people like me? And considering inherent racism is a very new concept introduced in the 1990s from my historical research in the archives, how can we say people like me are inherently racist? I've lived in so many places. Why are we Americans so interested in inherent racism considering it's a relatively new concept? What about my poor Irish gypsy people such as myself? What can we do? So how does that fit into our conversation?
Yeah, I would say inherent racism as a concept is not one that I would push or ascribe as the reality for everyone. I think when we're talking about racism, we have to recognize the difference between systemic racism and individual prejudice. So there are people who are prejudiced, who have certain beliefs, certain things that they've been taught that allow them to see others as less than because of their race, their ethnicity, their social status. And then systemic racism is, I think, where kind of inherent racism kind of leans in towards, where we're talking about the system that are built around us in society that allow racism to persist. What I really push for is to say that because of the way that our systems are built, that they are built around racism, they're built around allowing privilege for certain individuals or certain groups. Part of the reason that we have to work towards being anti-racist is that if we just go with the flow, if we just say, I'm not a racist, if I'm not, I don't have prejudice, I don't hate people of a different color, it's okay. The problem is if by saying, I'm not a racist, but I don't do anything about it, the systems that we're in continue to persist. And so I would never call somebody, inherently racist just because of who you're born. Like, racism also is a sin, which means that there's a sense of agency that comes with it. You can have a particular belief, or you can have a particular prejudice, but to act on that belief, to purposely go around and make people feel marginalized or treat people as they're less than, that's the sin. And so let's not conflate the two. Like, I would never tell someone who is white, you are inherently racist because of, who you are or how you were born. But I would definitely say we live in a world, in a system where systemically racism persists no matter what. Like, And that's what we're trying to fight against. I think that's what the church is really struggling to sort of say, how do we work against that? Because we've seen the way that it has had an effect on our brothers and sisters. The whole concept of justice stems from the idea that we're all made in the image and likeness of God. You know, all of us have human dignity. It's when that dignity is taken away that's when we recognize we're falling short, that's when we recognize that there's sin there. I don't know if that answers your question, Zach, but I hope that that kind of speaks to at least what we're hoping to get to, or what we're trying to lift up in this conversation.
Mumbi, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think of inherent privilege. When Zach talks about being Irish, I'm assuming he passes for a white man. And the reaction of society towards him and me will always be different in this part of the world. He's a white male, who kind of occupy the highest level of society in how they are treated and how people respond to them. And I'm a Black woman, and that's how people first perceive me. So that inherent privilege, as we said, is a set of advantages that you don't necessarily earn, but are given to you by society. So it's how we shall appear in a forum, and he'll probably be, people will assume he's supposed to be there, and people might mistake me for the cook or cleaner or janitor. This is what happens. I went through this in my own college one day. I volunteered for an event to hang coats, and people were tipping me because they thought I'd been hired for the evening to hang coats. This is the inherent privilege that is in this society. And as Darius said, there's so much about whether you're racist or prejudiced that only you can answer. So if you're walking down a street and you see two young Black men with hoodies, what does your body tell you? What does your mind tell you? What is your heart response? I will never see that, you know, and this is the thing that we're constantly countering. Or if somebody walks into a room and they want to give an opinion, do you think, oh, they couldn't know any better because of how they look like, you know? Or my values are better, or my assumptions of certain things are better. These things we cannot answer. And I'm not discounting that Zach is suffering different forms of oppression, a healthcare system that doesn't serve people who have no money, Black, brown, white. That's a form of oppression. The Irish, we knew when they came into this country, they were considered the Blacks of that time. They also went through all forms of oppression. But we also have to look at the history of America and see that every now and then, people who are underdogs are allowed acceptance into the majority, and we find a new group to oppress. This is a scapegoating thing that Richard Rohr talks about, that all societies do. In Black majority communities, we do it with ethnic groups. There's an underdog. This is the Bible, sacrificial lamb. Human beings have always, I don't know if that's an ego thing, found people to treat as less or to look at as less. So it's self-examination. It's not to say Black and brown people do not have prejudices. We all grow up with these things. In Kenya, you're told certain ethnicities are less than because of A, B, C, D. It's for you to keep examining and questioning, what are the signals that society and my family and friends keep sending to me, and do I truly believe this? Do I act out of them?
So thank you. This was a perfect, actually, and Zach, thank you for your question, because these can be uncomfortable things, you know, to talk about, which is why we're having today's conversation. This is where I want to do a little bit of an advertisement to everyone for next week's talk, which is intentionally titled "The Myths of White America and White Innocence and the History of Catholic Chicago," precisely because, you know, so many of us who identify as white grew up hearing, well, my Irish or Italian or Polish great-grandparents or grandparents came here, they didn't own slaves, they didn't have a nickel to their, you know, the no Irish need apply signs. A lot of this has been told to us growing up for those of us who are children of white immigrant families. And so next week, Matthew Kressler is a historian and a church historian and a social historian who has documented the ways in which white American Catholics who came here as immigrants became part of kind of white America and part of some of the systems of racism, and is going to look really close to home at some of the things that happened right here in Chicago and in Lincoln Park. So we really hope that you'll join us next week for that. That's where our next conversation is headed. I have a question. We're going to do 2 more questions and get everybody out of here. So I have a question from Rachel, who's joining us from outside Chicago.
Hey, Lovey, could you turn that down? I need to speak. Hello. I live in Jacksonville, Florida, and I go to the largest parish in the city. That is also, it's in the suburbs. It's affluent, and they have a Spanish speaking mass, for instance, and they have a couple of these small niche communities with the communities, but there's never integration with them except for maybe one day out of the year. And they're usually regulated to the historic church, which is the smaller one. And they're a big community. I mean, hearing what you said earlier about immigrants and refugees, Mumbai, it's um, I've been very concerned about the immigrant situation here in the United States for at least a couple of years, but I feel like I don't know what I can do. I unfortunately only speak English, and I don't know what to do. And I mean, I want to do more in regards to racial reconciliation and social justice, and I feel kind of stuck. I mean, so I'm not sure what can somebody like me, just this regular little Catholic, do out here to help with this.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rachel. I think we'll
Yeah.
thank you.
I think it would start, just ask the people in the pews next to you. I get a feeling you've been part of this church for a while, and start asking, why is the larger Spanish population relegated to the small church? Just in conversation, say, I wonder why this happens. I think there's a story, I think it's actually Bishop last week who said the same, that there was a church where the Spanish speaking people would be standing on the sides of the church. It was so full, and nobody had ever thought to question why this was. And I think it starts with conversation and planting those seeds, and then attend and ask for a listening session and want to know, let's hear from one another. And does this work? When we talk about hospitality as Christians, is it fair to give from our leftovers, or is it a hospitable thing to move to the smaller church because now we have a growing church that can fill up this space? Or can we actually worship together more than once a year? I think when you start planting seeds in people who have been part of the parish community for long, and we know the natural leaders who are there, who may not be elected, but are really leaders in the community, this is a genesis of sometimes a movement for change. And when you bump into the pastor and you're shaking his hand on your way out, ask him the same question. Why do the Spanish people, who are the majority, Spanish speaking, occupy the smaller church? I think unless somebody is trying to be very diplomatic and evasive, they would have to really think about it and provide a good answer. And I don't think there is a good answer. I think is that nobody has ever truly interrogated the issue. I think that's one way. Darius, I will leave it to you. I know we're running short of time.
I would just add that, Rachel, I can totally understand how overwhelming it can feel. And that question is a real one. What can one person do? But I think of all the stories that one person made the difference. One person, was the champion who lifted up the concern, whether it's a Rosa Parks or a Dr. Martin Luther King or an Oscar Romero. There's always people who have to step up and speak truth. And I definitely agree with Mumbi. Asking those questions, sometimes even when you know what the answer is, sometimes that's enough to begin to agitate people to question and wrestle with the inequalities and the injustices that are right before us. So recognize it's hard work, recognize it's frustrating, but I think you do your part by speaking truth and lifting up the voices of those who, maybe those voices aren't being heard, maybe those voices are being ignored, but you add your voice to that voice, and that voice becomes loud enough that it's hard for people to ignore when so many are speaking the same words.
Thank you. We've got one final question for you, but I do want to add, as someone who works for a parish, offer to show up and help. You know what I mean? In the sense that, what we need the laity. We need the people in the pews to say, I am here to do this work. What can we be doing as a parish? And so I mean, that's a great pitch for anyone who's on this call tonight or who's watching later on, is to ask your pastor, ask your parish community, how can I be part of undertaking this work and leading our parish to undertake this work? I know that it's a big challenge for us right now as parishes during the pandemic to keep people engaged. And yet we have seen that when it's an issue as important as racial justice, people will literally risk their health to be out in the streets saying, this is so urgent, we cannot ignore it. So if it's that important of an issue, we as a church need to be doing this work too. So please, if you're on this and you're a member of one of our parish communities and you'd like to be involved in the work for racial justice and dismantling systemic racism, email us, email your pastor, someone on your team, and say, what can we be doing? Here's the final question we're going to get you out on. What gives you hope?
Well, the young generation is giving me so much hope at the moment. I went out to protest. I was amazed at the leadership ability they are showing, how they're grappling with hard questions that we have run away from, especially as members of the church, such as race and sexuality and gender. They are creating spaces for one another. They're amplifying voices, and they're not waiting for elected leaders. They're showing up and saying, this is what I have to offer. And they're creating a space for somebody to manifest those gifts. They're giving me so much hope. And I stand here for the young people who are in this forum and are listening, and I ask forgiveness for how my generation has looked at you and said, your noses are always stuck to your technology, and that's all you have going for you, because you have harnessed the power of that technology to drive a movement in this country that we had never expected to see, and we are seeing real change. And that movement has grown and gone beyond the borders of this country to all parts of the world. That gives me hope, but also my faith in Jesus does give me hope. And my congregation that has been extremely supportive of this and my work, with what is also a subject that they are also grappling with and struggling with, being that they were predominantly white congregation for so many years. I have to say that the Paschal mystery and the suffering, death, and resurrection, which is precious blood spirituality, I truly believe in that. That this is a process that we all go through. This is what we have to go through as a church, even to come out with what is truly true and of God. The rest are just manifestations of ego and such stuff that comes and interferes with the goodness of human nature and human relations.
Part of me just wants to say ditto, because that was so well said and so beautiful. I think what I'll add, two things that also echo what Mumbi shared. The stepping up of young people right now, I think, is really important and really powerful. The number of protests that are not only being led by young people, but being organized by young people, that gives me hope. Because this younger generation, where diversity and experiences of others, experiences of being in solidarity with those who are marginalized is such a norm for them, they are stepping up and saying, this is not okay and we will not stand for it. And for me, the diversity of the young people that you see showing up, and really just the diversity of people. For a long time, these protests that have happened for generations were often, one group protesting for themselves. And when I look at some of the protests and some of the images you see the diversity of different ages, different cultures, different races, different religions, different ages. I think the ability that this is a cross-generational movement, I think says a lot to us. And then I think the fact that it's not going away. The conversation could have easily died down weeks ago, and yet the protests have continued. The conversations have continued, and the sense that there needs to be something more than just talking, but doing of it, is what really gives me hope. I don't think, using Pope Francis's word, I don't think we're in an era of change. I think we're in the change of an era. And I think we have to really recognize, with all the changes and all the uncertainty that's among us, we have to recognize where the Spirit's working in that. And I really do believe that the Spirit's working right now in really profound ways. And so that consumes a lot of my prayer life right now, especially because I don't know what else to pray for. Mostly I'm praying for 2020 to come to an end before everything falls apart. But yeah, that's what gives me hope during these difficult times.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you for everyone who participated tonight and who is able to watch this at a later time. We want to continue to recommend that as part of our educational process that you consult the Parish Anti-Racism Resource Guide, where many of the people who've already been doing this work of education, Father Brian Massingale, Shannon D. Williams, who is chronicling the contributions of Black religious sisters in this country, all of those resources, those articles, those books, those webinars are already listed in our Parish Anti-Racism Resource Guide. So we really encourage you to check out some of those, along with some non-church based ones like The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein and How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. We really want to have people having these conversations in book clubs, in small groups, and in every aspect of our parish and our larger church life. So thank you again for tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you for both of our speakers.